Excellent. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. This has been a bit of a learning curve for me. I'm not sure exactly what the style normally of the Shiur is or of the source sheet, so I hope it was at least somewhat accessible. As I said to Shelby earlier, I think I'm going to start this year. We'll do on electricity, and we'll see how far we get, and then we'll go back to Shabbos Halacha, given that anyway there's been a gap since I gave out those sheets. So the halachic debate around electricity is a very significant one. It need not be said that the use of electrical artifacts is nowadays completely endemic. It's on just everywhere around us, and perhaps the most significant impact on Shabbos nowadays, in a time when we rarely plow fields or weave garments anyway. So Shabbos, electricity is probably the most common use, most common impact of the halachos of Shabbos, and very, very relevant, and ever increasingly challenging, to be honest. It becomes harder and harder to find hotels that don't have electronic door cards to get into them, blocks of flats that people rent where there's automatic lighting, and every time you walk up and down the corridor, you're affecting and tweaking lighting, and who knows where the future will go with automated houses and intelligent houses and the like. So these are very, very significant shilas, and I think probably when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, maybe 50% of Hilchos Shabbos shilas get down to electricity really nowadays. So it's a very complicated and important area of halacha. So the debate really around electricity started now something like 130 years ago, in the late 1800s, as electricity arrives primarily in East Europe, and slightly less also of a debate and a discussion in North Africa. And initially, the main use of electricity was around light bulbs. So a filament light bulb. An electric current flows through the filament, and as a result, the filament glows. And in a hut or hovel in East Europe, a flickering 15-watt light bulb lights up. And the question is, are you allowed to generate that on Shabbos? Are you allowed to turn on and off the switch? So I'm going to basically in this year try and follow through the sources, initially looking at, effectively following the historic debate as it took place. So we'll start off talking about light bulbs, and then we'll move over to the pure use of electric currents, where there are no light bulbs, where there aren't filament lights at all. And we'll see these are, in a sense, two very different questions. In other words, the first halachic debate is around triggering the lighting of the filament in the light bulb, and what malachas that would involve. And the second set of halachic debates would be around triggering a current where there is no glowing filament, and what would the halachas be of that. So that's the structure of what we'll look at today, basically. I'm calling them filament light bulbs, or they're also referred to as incandescent light bulbs, basically a glowing filament. So what would be the halacha of heating metal until it glows?
Rabbi Zevin,
yeah.
LED would be a different case?
Yes. So in the second source sheet, I looked at LED lights. Basically speaking, the halachic question that always one has to ask oneself is there a glowing filament, which is a metal wire which is becoming white hot, in which case we need to learn the filament halachas, or is there not, in which case it isn't. So what things don't have electric filaments? Everything really nowadays. So an LED light, a fluorescent light, a phone, whether a landline or a smartphone or a brick phone, a fridge, almost everything doesn't have glowing filaments anymore. And almost always, therefore, the shiur is the second sugya of electricity, not the original sugya of electricity. Electric filaments, glowing wires are really only found nowadays in 2 or 3 scenarios, either if you still have an old-fashioned light bulb, or in a freezer which has a de-icer. So the way that the de-icer works in a freezer is that there's a glowing filament which heats up and melts ice that builds up accumulated ice in the freezer, and that's what stops the ice accumulating. So those are really almost the only examples of where there's actually a glowing filament in domestic use. Obviously,
well, turning on an oven, surely the thing of the oven is the same thing.
Yeah, so an oven is the third example of that. So you have filament light bulbs, you have wires in freezers, and then glowing strips with ovens, with electric heat, some forms of electronic heaters and the like. So those are the three scenarios really where you have it in domestic appliances. Industrial obviously is a little different, so that's where the questions apply. So what we're going to do is basically we're going to look at, first of all, at the glowing metal strips which exist in filament lights or in heating filaments, and then we'll look at electricity, which is in almost all other appliances where there's nothing glowing red hot or white hot. So really the sugya starts with this, in a sense this isn't a new shayla, heating up metal till it glows red hot is something that used to be done in the past. So do you have the source sheets that I gave out? Does everyone have them in front of them? So again, I don't know if you want me to go through all the sources or just sort of briefly summarize them. But in source one, I brought a Gemara in Yevamos, and the context of the Gemara is capital punishment. Now, amongst the four types of capital punishment in Halacha is one punishment called Shreifa, where the criminal is burned. And the method through which they are burned, and forgive me, this is a little gory, is by melting metal, lead, and pouring the metal down the throat of the criminal, such that their innards would be burnt. This is the method of streifa that's used in Halachot. I'm sorry to later I'm causing to wince. And the Gemara there is discussing what malachos this would involve if one was to do this on Shabbos. And the background, the context of the Gemara, we'll just have a quick look at the Gemara. The Gemara says, Havara de Beis-Din. When Beis-Din does Havara, what's the case? Bishul Pasilahu. And this is the malacha that's involved when Beis-Din burns, is the cooking of the metal strip, which is melted. For Omer of Sheishes, says Rav Sheishes, Mali Bishul Pasila, Mali Bishul Samamonim. What difference does it make whether you're cooking a metal strip or whether you're cooking herbs? So the background to this is that of the Lamed Tes Malachas, one of the Lamed Tes Malachas is Bishul. Now, all the 39 Malachas are learned from actions or activities, creative activities that took place in the building of the Mishkan. And in the building of the Mishkan, where did Bishul take place? The answer is with the Bishul Samamonim, with the boiling of the herbs and the spices and the dyes that were used for dyeing the cloth that was used in the Mishkan. Now, in the regular running of the Mishkan, or in day-to-day life, there was the baking of the lechem haponim and various other things, and the roasting of korbanos and so on. But the Lamed Tes Malachos are defined by things that took place in the building of the Mishkan. So in the building of the Mishkan, there was bishul samamonim, there was the boiling of the herbs or the spices or the dyes that were used in the construction of the Mishkan. And basically, Rav Sheishes says over here, what difference does it make whether you're cooking spices or herbs or you're cooking metal? Either way, this is the malacha of bishul, and therefore the issue with melting metal on Shabbos is the malacha of bishul. Now, let's have a quick look at Rashi. Psila shel Eves, says Rashi, the strip of metal which is of lead, matzich v'zor kol piv, one melts it and throws it into the mouth, v'yoredes v'seich me'av, and it goes into the innards of the person. V'hai bishul gomahu, says Rashi, this is complete bishul. V'av menachas, and av menachas, not even a tolda. Again, as we know, there are 39 categories of malachas, and then they have subcategories which are called toldas. This isn't even a tolda. So in Mishkan Yalfinon, we learn out the office malachas in Mishkan. Or bishul samamonim hayu b'melachas in Mishkan, the cooking of the herbs in the Mishkan. The seva tcheles v'tila shani, in order to dye with tcheles or with the red thread that was used. So the Mishkan had boiling that took place, and Rav Sheishes says that this is an av malacha. Melting metal is exactly the same as melting as cooking food. Now, I should point out that this is a tremendous chiddush, really. This is not an obvious comparison at all, because well, what do you think? I mean, do you think this is the same as bishul, different bishul? What do you think of Rav Sheishes' this comparison?
I think we got a bit I don't know. We were trying to work out why this isn't lotavaru eish, meaning when I light the metal, aren't I lighting a flame? It lights up, as opposed to the other stuff which just gets cooked, but it doesn't actually become a light.
Okay, so this is a superb point, and you're right to get confused about this. Basically, the structure of what we're going to look at with metal is considering one of two possible malachas, either bishul or havara. And on the heading, I wrote heating metal until it glows, bishul or havara, question mark. So you are correct, there are two malachos to think about over here. One is you're causing the metal to glow if it becomes red hot, or kal v'chomer if it becomes white hot, in which case we could think of this as lighting a fire, or we could think of this as bishul, which is the first source that we looked at. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to consider each possibility one by one and see whether that's relevant over here. For now, we're just considering the possibility of bishul, and we're seeing whether bishul applies. And then we will move on to your suggestion, and we'll see whether hadlaka or havara applies to this case also. So we're just taking them one by one. So for now, just thinking about bishul alone, what do we think about the comparison to bishul?
And I think a lot of people think about bishul in the context of food and not anything more widely. Although I guess the definition of bishul is improvement of something by the transfer of heat. It's not specifically related to food, but it's perhaps an unusual comparison in this, because most of us think of bishul as related to food rather than anything else.
Excellent. Okay, so you've actually said both a question and an answer in your sort of short sentence that you said. This ostensibly seems quite different to bishul. You're absolutely right. We think of bishul in the context of food, though in the Mishkan, let's remind ourselves, the bishul that was done was bishul samamonim, which is preparing dyes for the dyeing process, for the colouring process, as opposed to for food. Nonetheless, this does seem a little bit of a stretch to compare it to bishul, because with bishul there's a sort of improvement or a permanent change, and nonetheless the Gemara considers this also to be a bishul. You very nicely said that bishul is the improvement of something by the transfer of heat, and that seems to be the point of the Gemara. That at the end of the day, the metal here is improved or altered through heat, even though it's only temporary, because of course the metal will cool down and will go back to its original state. Nonetheless, this is bishul because it's change of something, improvement of something through transfer of heat. In a moment, we'll see a Gemara that explicitly discusses this, and basically the Gemara says anything which is improved or the state is altered, so it's softened when it's normally hard, or it's hardened when it's normally softened. This is through the transfer of heat. This would be considered bishul. This would be enough to be the malacha of bishul. So that's the explanation of source one, the Gemara in Yevamos.
Is that something to do with nolad as well, though? I guess if you think about ice melting, it's not intentionally applying heat, but there is some, compared to its previous state, it is existing in a more warm state.
Okay, so this is also a very important point. We will get to nolad later in the context of electricity when we look at the pure issue of creating current in a circuit. But nolad is not in and of in itself anything to do with heat. Nolad is, as its name suggests, bringing something new into existence. So ice becoming water or water becoming ice is a change of state, and therefore is bringing something new into existence. And there may be other examples that are completely different. We'll see later, causing a reach, a perfumed smell or scent to appear in something would also be an example of molid. So bringing anything new and significant into existence, we'll see later that those who argue bringing an electric current to existence, that would be an example of molid, but that's nothing to do with bishul. That's a separate rationale for the prohibition of electricity, which we'll get to shortly. So for now,
does that mean that bishul is therefore irreversible? And something we don't expect it to return to the state that it was previously in, by comparison to this metal?
Well, it's a good point, but the Gemara at least seems to be considering the possibility that, and according to Rav Sheshes, this is indeed the conclusion, that even though it will reverse because the metal will harden eventually, nonetheless, since there is a significant time period in which the bishul has achieved a purpose, that's enough for the malacha of bishul. Now, this does bring us into a broader topic, which we're not going to dwell on too much for now. Maybe we'll look at it a little later, which is a malacha has to be a creative achievement. And normally speaking, a malacha is only a malacha de-icers if it's a permanent creative achievement, not if it's temporary. So for example, if I write on a piece of paper, that would be the malacha of kosev, of writing. If I form letters and condensation on a windscreen, on a window, that would only be drabanan because it's temporary, it's not permanent. Nonetheless, we always have to be a bit careful when we think about temporary and permanent in the context of malacha, because here comes the second gory fact of this evening. Nothing in life is permanent. Unfortunately, everything is temporary. So what do we mean by permanent in the context of halacha? We can't mean it lasts forever, because nothing lasts forever in life. So we must mean it has a significance to the amount of time that it lasts. And with the molten metal, or the softened metal, there's a significance to the amount of time it lasts, because in the meantime, it can be used for something useful. So the molten metal can be poured, in the case of capital punishment, it can be poured down someone's throat, or it can be melted and put into a particular shape or beaten into a form. So even though it's only a temporary softening, nonetheless, that's long-term enough and significant enough to be considered a melacha according to Rav Sheshes. So either way, whether Rav Sheshes is a final word on the matter or not, we'll see as a debate. But either way, this is the opinion of Rav Sheshes in source 1, that melting metal is analogous to bishul. And he's so convinced that it's analogous to bishul that he thinks it is an av, not a tolda. That's Rav Sheshes' view.
Can I just clarify? Sorry, my face has frozen, but I'm still here.
Yes.
So when we're talking about boiling up basomim, there's two things that are being heated and there's two things that are changing state. So are we referring to the boiling of the water, which is changing color to make it a dye? Or are we talking about the heating the basomim themselves, which again probably has some at least short-term effect on the basomim? And again, with the molten metal, the point of it isn't to change the metal. The point of it is to burn the person. So when you're talking about Sarefa, you're talking actually about using the molten metal as a heat source rather than heating it in its own right.
So again, at the moment now, we're not yet considering Havara. We're only considering bishul. And in the Melach of bishul of the Samamonim, the dye, the bishul that's referred to is the Samamonim themselves. It's not about the water, it's about the dye itself. Now, even though melachos have to be constructive and have to serve a purpose doesn't mean the end goal, the final purpose. It's enough to be a purpose that it is a stepping stone on the way to something else. So for example, if you think about the first 11 melachos, the end goal is to get a cooked food or a loaf of bread. But there are 11 melachos that get you there till the food is cooked. There's plowing and sowing a seed, and then there's harvesting, and there's grinding, and there's sieving, and there's kneading, making it into dough, and then cooking, which is baking the dough in the oven, and so on and so forth. So there's 11 steps till you get to the baking of the bread. Now, you don't really have any interest in plowed earth. No one wants plowed earth for the sake of plowed earth. No one is interested in sown seeds just for the sake of the wheat that's grown. There is an ultimate goal, which is I want my loaf of bread, and everything else is the means to get there. Nonetheless, this is a temporary way station, a temporary stopping station on the way, which is I want to achieve the goal of having a plowed field. I want to have sown seeds. I want to have a kneaded dough, and that's enough for it to be a melacha. So similarly over here, the ultimate goal is to dye the wool. But for now, all I'm doing is I'm boiling the samamonim, and that's enough to be the melacha of bishul in the Mishkan. That's not controversial. That's really the Av Melacha, one of the 39 melachos of bishul, and that's the scenario. And all Rav Sheshes is doing is saying that that's analogous to melting metal. Why do I want the melting metal? Because it's something I can only do with molten metal that I can't do with regular metal, which is shaping the metal into some form or killing people with it, or whatever it may be. But the core end goal, the temporary way station that I want, the stage that I'm trying to achieve, is the melting of the metal, and that's enough to be the melacha of bishul according to Rav Sheshes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so that's source of the Gemara in Yevamos. That's source 1. If we look at source 2, this is the Gemara in Shabbos. And again, I think it's just probably in the interest of efficiency, just worth us reading it together. So the heading of this Gemara is a halosh va'ofer. Basically, the Gemara is working through the 39 melachos. That's the context for this Gemara in Shabbos Daf Ayin Daled. And the Gemara is working its way steadily, one melacha by melacha. And it now gets up to the melacha of kneading, which we don't need to go into, and then ofer, baking, which we do. So the basic first point that Rav Papa makes on the Gemara is that even though the Mishnah lists the melacha as ofer, as baking, that's just because that's the more common scenario in terms of human use. But in terms of what happened in the Mishkan, the melacha was not baking, but was boiling samamonim, as we've just seen. That's where Rashi got from this idea of boiling the samamonim, boiling the spices or the herbs for dyeing. Rashi got that from this Gemara over here, in which the Gemara says that the Tana of the Mishnah lists human use rather than the context that the melacha took place in the Mishkan with Mishkan use. So let's just read the inside. One who kneads and one who bakes. This is source 2. Omer Rav Papa, says Rav Papa, Shavak Tana Didon, Bishul Samamonim, Dahava B'Mishkan. Our Tana, in other words, the author of our Mishnah, who lists the 39 melachos, leaves the scenario of boiling samamonim, which was the scenario in the Mishnah, v'nokat ofer, and instead says baking, exclamation mark. This is strange. Answers the Gemara, Tana Didon, Sidura de Pas Nokat. Our Tana is listing the Sidura de Pat, the process of making bread, to use as a more common scenario, which is baking bread. But in essence, it doesn't really make a difference. Bishul and Ofer are both of melachas. They are jointly both scenarios of one of the 39 of its melachas, the melacha of baking stroke cooking. It doesn't make a difference. Now we get to the next critical part of it. So that's part one. That's where Bishul Samanim comes from. Now we have another Amar who makes another statement. Amar of Achabar of Avira. Haiman de Shota Sichsa La'atuna. Chayiv Mishum Mevashel. So someone threw a cloth into a piece of material to heat it up, and the Gemara there says that you're chayav mishum mevashel, that you're obligated because of mevashel. So I'm just seeing someone knocking up. Sorry, apologies, I'm lost in shul. Someone else came. Where are we up to? Rav Achabar Avira. Yes, so Rav Achabar Avira says, Haiman, so let me find my place. Haiman the shot of Sichser. So someone who throws a, maybe I should just give a little bit of a background into this. If you have a piece of wood, when you cut a piece of wood off a tree, it's fresh and it's soft, and therefore it's not useful if you need a hard piece of wood. So they used to throw this wood into the oven and effectively bake it in order to harden it. So someone who threw a piece of wood into an oven in order to make it a peg of sorts is chayav because of cooking. Says the Gemara Pshita, this is obvious. You would have said your intention is not to soften, but is to harden the peg. And therefore you would think it isn't mevashel. Nonetheless, we say, since it first is softened and then it goes hardened, that's enough for bishul. Omar Rava Barav Hana, then the Rava Barav Hana says something else. Haiman the Artach Kufra, Taj Mishum Mevashel, someone who melts tar or pitch. So again, tar or pitch are hard, and you melt them in the oven. Yochai Mishum Mevashel. Pshita asks the Gemara, it's obvious. My detema, given the hard of the akish, emala, since the tar was hard before it was cooked, and it's hard after it's cooked, you might have thought that the softening in between doesn't make it cooking. Kamashmalon again that this is considered permanent enough. Okay, so just to summarize what we've said, let's have a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Shata sichsa shehishlik yosif lachlatano." Commonly, you throw in a peg, a soft peg, into the oven in order to harden it. This is in order to dry it. That's called the melacha of bishul. So basically, what we've learned so far is that bishul isn't only with food items; it's even with dyes. That's the classic example of bishul in the Mishkan. And bishul isn't only with bishul is also when you're softening things for production purposes, irrespective of whether the softening is temporary and it becomes hard again, irrespective of whether the long-term goal is to harden, but it goes via the stage of softening. Softening something is called the melacha of bishul, and we have two examples of this: a piece of wood which you put in the oven to bake, to harden, but in the meantime temporarily it becomes softened as the liquid content of the wood is heated, or tar or pitch, which is melted in the oven, and then you want to spread the tar on the roof or wherever it is that you want to use the tar, or as a lining to make something waterproof, even though the long-term goal is for it to be hardened. Nonetheless, this is called bishul. So this is a central Gemara in the context of the halachas of the use of electricity, that softening of a filament, that softening something is with heat is considered a melacha. Now, one of you, sorry, yeah.
Just a question. So that's implying that softening has to be part of the process. Nobody says, but oh, because it's hardened, therefore it's asr. It's because it first gets soft and then gets hard. That's why it's asr.
Correct. The softening is the critical part of the malacha. Yeah, absolutely. Spot on. Yes. Yeah.
Is there an example of how you can cook or bake something where it only gets hard without getting soft first?
I don't know. I mean, I've never looked into it, but when you boil an egg, for example, it seems to me that it only gets hardened in the process. When you bake dough, it seems to me it only gets hardened in the process, but I don't know.
And yet there doesn't seem to be so. But nobody comes along and says, "Well, that's you're allowed to bake an egg on Shabbos."
Correct, because they're the critical point is that you're making it edible. Yes. Yeah, that seems to be what comes out of Gemara. Okay. What I'd like to, because I'm conscious of the passage of time, and I want to try and get through more this evening. Is just briefly have a look at source 3 and source 4 in the Rambam, and then maybe we'll jump all the way through to source 6, the bottom of source 6, just for the purpose of clarity. So the Rambam Poskins really this Gemara. Let's have a look at source 3. This is on the Rambam in Peik Halacha Vav. Hamatich echad mimenu matchus kol shehu. If one melts any form of metal, or machamim es amateches ad shetase gacheles, or one heats up metal until it becomes a glowing ember, it becomes glowing like coal. Harizeh told us mavashal. This is a tolda of mavashal. Then the Rambam says, "V'chein hamamasi sesa donag oes hachelev oes hazefes v'hakofer v'hagafis." So again, these are all examples of pitch and tar and so on. So just get the translation. Hamamasi sesa hadonag, that's someone who melts wax. Chelev is fat. Zefes, Varkofa, Vargofis, that's different types of tar and pitch. Or Kyotzbem, any other examples. How is that told as Mavashal Chayiv? This is all a tolda of Mavashal and its Chayiv. Similarly, now here the Rambam says about something that becomes hardened. If you cook or heat an earthenware container, cheres, a clay container, you're chayiv mishum mavashal. You're chayiv because of mavashal. Klolo shaldava. The principle is bein ripa guf kosher. Whether you softened a hard object, be'esh with fire, meshahik sheguf rach hayir chayiv mishum mavashal. In either case, you're chayiv mishum mavashal. So even though, as Shalvi you correctly pointed out in the Gemara, we only see that softening is the malacha, the Rambam extends it to basically changing the state of anything through heat is malacha. So, Tani, your formulation, you said, of the malacha was improving anything through heat. The Rambam formulates it as changing the state of anything through heat is the malacha of Mavashal on Shabbos. This is the conclusion of the Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos Perek Tes. If we jump now to the Rambam in Perek Yud Beis of Hilchos Shabbos, Halacha Aleph, the Rambam says, just go up this halacha.
Sorry to interrupt. By that definition, wouldn't melting something also be bishul?
Sorry?
Wouldn't allowing something to melt also be bishul then, changing it from a solid to a liquid through heat?
No.
I don't mean actively heating. I'm saying you take something out of the freezer and it defrosts.
No, because it's simply allowing it to remain at room temperature and the process is occurring by itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if you hadn't taken it out, it wouldn't have melted.
True. Nonetheless, it's not applying heat. It's merely room temperature. In other words, the room temperature is considered the default, and heat is applying something extra to that rather than the same temperature.
Okay. I mean, it wasn't in that by default, but I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Correct. Nonetheless, the room temperature is not considered as applying heat. It's just considered the environment. Yeah. Okay. Let's have a look at Perek Yud Beis Halacha Aleph. Hamavi kol shu chayiv. Someone who lights any fire is chayiv. This is very interesting. This is in a case where you need the ash that's created. If a person lit a fire with a destructive intention, then they're potter because it's makalkel. So the background to this is that you're only chayav for malacha where there's a constructive activity for it. And therefore, if you light something with intention of burning it, even though you have a purpose in so doing, for example, maybe you want to dispose of some furniture or branches that have collected in your garden, or a pile of weeds, and it's convenient to destroy it, to burn it. Nonetheless, since fundamentally it's an act of destruction, not an act of creativity, you would be potter on Shabbos. Let's jump. Then the Rambam, very interesting Rambam, but we'll just quickly read through it just because it's very fascinating. But we'll focus on the last words of the Rambam. Then the Rambam says, if you set fire to the produce or the dwelling place of someone, and your intention is to take revenge on an enemy, then this is also considered a constructive rather than destructive act. Why? His intention is to seek revenge from an enemy. His mind is cooled down, and his anger is settled. This is like someone who tears someone as an act of mourning for the dead or out of anger, because they're chayiv, or someone who injures someone at the time of the fight. All these are a constructive activity because of their yetzer hara. So basically, just to summarize, even though this is slightly off topic, the Rambam says that every melacha has to be a constructive activity, not constructive in the sense of what the Chofetz Chaim would consider constructive, or Rabbi Saul Salanter would consider constructive. In others, not constructive in a spiritual sense. It has to be a positive achievement. So if I'm lighting something, even though it's my intention to dispose of it, but that's fundamentally a destructive action because I'm removing something from the world. If I'm lighting something because I want to heat myself up, then that's a positive action. If I'm lighting something because I want the light, that's a positive action. If I'm lighting something because I want the ash, that's a positive action. And if I'm lighting something because through so doing I revenge myself on my enemy, that's also called a positive action because I've achieved a goal that I wanted as opposed to just removing something. That's the central idea that the Rambam says. Now we get back to our core point. Similarly, someone who lights a candle or wood, whether to generate heat or light, the person is chayiv. And the Rambam says, someone who heats iron, in order to purify it, the mayim in water, then again, this is a tolda, a subcategory of burning or lighting, and therefore they are chayiv. So just again, just to give a little background to this, I'm no expert on metal production, but I'm told that if you heat metal and then you cool it down, it strengthens the metal, and this is what the Rambam is talking about. No one heats metal and then immediately cools it down in order to strengthen it. This is the melacha of mavi. So why have we had to look at all of this? Because basically what the Rambam here is telling us is that if you heat metal, there is the melacha of mavi. That's the melacha of mavi, and therefore you are chayiv for that. Now, basically what we have here in effect is a type of contradiction between two Rambams. In source 3, which was the Rambam in Perek Tes Halacha Vav, the Rambam said that if you heat metal, you're chayiv from a vashel because you soften it. And in source 4, which is Perek Yud Beis, the Rambam says that you're chayiv mishum mavi because you are kindling it. Now, I have to tell you, the Rambam that says that heating metal in order to strengthen it is mavi is not at all obvious. It is true that the metal becomes glowing hot, but that's not normally how we think of burning. Normally we think of burning as if you burn a candle or you burn wood, you're converting the wood or the candle into the fuel. In the case of the metal, you're not converting anything. The metal becomes glowing red hot, and then the metal's heat subsides, and the same bit of metal is left behind. Nonetheless, the Rambam considers this to be mavi. The Raavad that I printed disagrees with the Rambam, but this is what the Rambam says. So there's basically two approaches how to put this information together. One way of dealing with this is what's printed in source 6 near the bottom of source 6. I printed the Shabbat, which is the footnotes of the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah. Let's just have a quick read of the Shabbat at the bottom of source 6, at the bottom of page 2. But by Perek Yud Beis Kosav, the Rambam writes in chapter 12, if you heat metal, told us mavi. Then he says, the Lechem Mishnah answers, and I printed for you the Lechem Mishnah, the Tati Isnu, there's both of them. Originally, when the metal became soft, then you're chayiv from mavashel. And after that, when it becomes a burning coal, in other words, when it glows red hot, then you are chayav for burning, because it becomes something that is burnt up with heat. So basically, the Mishnah Berurah understands the Rambam to be saying that when you first heat metal, it becomes soft. That would be the malacha of bishul, and when it glows red hot, it would become mavir. It would be considered burning. There are other ways of understanding the Rambam. There are poskim who say that it depends on your intention when you're heating it. If your intention was to soften the metal in order to work the metal, then that would be the malacha of bishul. And if your malacha was to make it red hot, for it to act as a heat source or to strengthen the metal, then that would be mavir, because your intention is to make it into something hot. So there are a number of ways to resolve this Rambam. Nonetheless, what we have finally come to by the conclusion of our discussion is there are two potential malachas in making a strip of metal red hot. Malacha number one is the softening, which is mevashel, and malacha number two is the glowing, which is mavir, like lighting a flame. This is the conclusion we come to, having learnt the Rambam and the various Gemaras that we looked at. So I put a heading at the beginning of page 1, in which I said, heating metal till it glows, bishul or havhara. The answer is both have sources. The Rambam may be of the view that it is both bishul and havhara, it's both cooking and burning. Or the Rambam may consider it depends on your intention, whether the malacha is considered to be burning or considered to cooking. Either way, these are the two malachas which are relevant over here. And the Poskim in the late 1800s, as they considered the use of electricity on Shabbos, all came to the conclusion that turning on a filament light on Shabbos, where there is a glowing red hot or white hot strip of metal, would be forbidden either for mavir or for mevashel or for both, based on the sources that we have seen. So just to summarize, in the old-fashioned shilas, the old-fashioned questions around use of filament light bulbs, the consensus was arrived at after looking at the issue that we have enough sources to make it clear that heating metal until it glows hot is forbidden, though there is some confusion as to whether it is one malacha of mavir or one malacha of mevashel, or both combined. Nonetheless, in practice, one or the other applies. Now, actually, before we go on to the next stage, any questions or thoughts around that just before we look at the next week?
Just from a practical perspective, in the early days of electricity, I don't know how much they were used in domestic contexts versus industrial contexts. I mean, I presume, like electric light bulbs are not widely used domestically. What they would obviously wouldn't be able to turn it on. We never had any of the shilas about timers and groma and things like that we have now.
Yes.
So what would the question be? Were you allowed to physically ignite the switch, or somehow turn that light bulb on Shabbos? Was that the question?
Yes. So the question was that as filament light bulbs began being rolled out domestically, the Poskim in East Europe and Germany became concerned: is one allowed to turn a light bulb off or on? Now to us in 2022, we think this is a non-shilah. Of course, you're not allowed to. At the time, this was not obvious at all, and depending on how you define the malacha, would affect whether you thought this was allowed or not. And almost universally, the Poskim came to the conclusion that turning on a filament light bulb is either mavir or mevashel, and therefore wouldn't be allowed.
Was there any question as to whether one was allowed to benefit from the light of the light bulb, having turned it on prior to Shabbos?
No, if it was turned on prior to Shabbos, then it would be no different to candles which are lit before Shabbos, and therefore that would be allowed. By the way, I mean, just as a piece of background information, for many years, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Brisker, used to make Havdalah, and the Boromir Ha'esh flame that he used to use a filament or incandescent light bulb. And the reason he did this was to publicize that this is Eish. He wanted people to realize that this is a flame in Halacha, because he held this was Mavir. This is like lighting a flame. And the same way as lighting a flame when you light a piece of wood is Mavir, similarly, a glowing filament is Mavir, and therefore he used to use that for Havdalah in order to make his position clear. By the way, I wasn't intending to go into this, but since you asked about this, there is a debate around Yom Tov. So far we've been discussing Shabbos. What would be the halacha about lighting a filament light bulb on Yom Tov? So if the malacha is mavir, then this would be creating a new flame, and we're not allowed to create a new flame on Yom Tov. If the Malach is Mavashel, it'd be a bit of an interesting one, whether this would be a problem on Yom Tov, because of course we are allowed to cook on Yom Tov. Nonetheless, as I said, the consensus is that it is both Mavashel and Mavi, and therefore even on Yom Tov you're not allowed to turn on the lights. There were Poskim who thought that you are allowed to turn on lights on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, I'm sorry. They were of the opinion that it is not considered creating a new flame to turn on an electric current, because the heat is in existence already from the battery or power station which is powering this.
You're just opening the access.
Sorry?
Yeah, sorry, I've just heard this theory, that the theory is like you're just opening the gateway to your own access, that the current is already flowing.
They viewed electricity as effectively there's a fire already light, and I'm lifting up the gate, and now the fire can spread to the light bulb.
That is quite accurate, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. Interesting comment. So there was senior Poskim, including Poskim from North Africa and in East Europe, the Aruch HaShulchan, no less. So one of the most senior Poskim of all time, of the modern era, who viewed it as removing a gate and allowing the fire to spread. No one was convinced by their arguments, and the reason is because it is true that electricity is electrons spreading and effectively allowing them to spread, but an electron is not fire. An electron shouldn't be viewed as little bits of fire, which are then, you're lifting them up and they're now spreading. So again, if you have an existing fire on Yom Tov, you're allowed to light from one flame to another flame. With electricity, there is no flame in the wire or in the battery waiting to burst out, and by lifting it up, the flame is now bursting out. A flame comes into existence because with the motion of the electrons, the filament heats up and then begins glowing. So no one was convinced by this argument, and I think this Aruch HaShulchan has been decisively written out of halachic practice, and the universal view, as the issues were thrashed out, is that this is considered creating a new flame. There is no flame latent in the battery or in the power station. It's simply electrons which are set into motion, and they cause the filament light to glow. So it's called bringing a new flame into existence, and therefore both on Shabbos and on Yom Tov this would be also.
It makes sense because it's a fundamental law.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's one of the fundamental laws of physics that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred from one form into another. So if you're going to use that argument, you could argue that, everything is already in existence and you can't create anything, can you? So I agree that doesn't really hold water.
The Aruch HaShulchan was. It was not considered to be an accurate understanding of how electricity works. You're correct, and there was a lot of discussion around this point, and I'm, as to the best of my knowledge, it has left no impact on halacha. When we move on to our Shiur about Shabbos Halacha, I'll discuss the place or position or importance of minority views in halacha. But not every minority view in halacha leaves an impact on the halachic system, and this view of the Aruch HaShulchan and some of the North African Poskim, I don't think has left any impact on the halachic system.
It's interesting because, and like you said, this is more topic of psak, but there are opinions that we generally hold out not necessarily accurate, but still become psak, like using an umbrella on Shabbos. I believe it's the chas sofer. His rationale is not accepted, but his psak is.
So it's a broader discussion, but very briefly, in the case of the umbrella, there's no new information that we have that the Chasam Sofer didn't have. He was aware of everything we were aware of, and in his assessment of the facts that were relevant, he came to the conclusion that many others struggled to understand. But there wasn't a piece of information that we now think was he knew what we know and we know what he knew. In other words, there's nothing new that we've got. So it comes my shikol hadas versus the Chasam Sofer's shikol hadas. So the weight of the Chasam Sofer is such that the Chasam Sofer was probably the most prominent posek of the last 400 or 500 years. We had a scholar in residence at Nair a while back who for various reasons made a study of which poskim were quoted most, and the Chasam Sofer is the most prominently quoted posek of the last 500 years of Jewish history. So it comes down to my shikol hadas versus the chasam sofer shikol hadas. So the weight of chasam sofer trumps, even though no one fully understands his reasoning. In the case of the Aruch HaShulchan, however, it's a little different, because in the case of the Aruch HaShulchan, it would appear that the Aruch HaShulchan had a model of electricity which was inaccurate, in which he viewed the fire as being latent in the wires and simply being transported to the filament. And that's certainly not the way we view it. As Shiur just said, it's a change of energy from one form to another. And when it's in the wires, it isn't fire, it's a different type of energy. And when it enters into the filament, at that point, the fire is created as the filament glows red hot. So in that case, their view has left no impact on to the best of my knowledge, has left no impact on the halachic system. And even someone as great and as important to Poskim as the Aruch HaShulchan is considered to have misunderstood how electricity works, or somehow had a different concept of electricity that isn't in line with how anyone else understood it. By the way, I should say strongly, it's not me saying that. I wouldn't say that. The Chaim Ozer Grudzinski, and his who was considered the preeminent posek of that time, in his Sefer, Halachic work, that Achiezer says is very, very strongly. He's very dismissive of this view of the Aruch HaShulchan. With Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was considered in more recent times as the most prominent posek in understanding electricity, also took a very strong stance against the view of the Aruch HaShulchan, and it's because of the weight of these authorities and the fact that the Aruch HaShulchan's model of how electricity works seems to be one that we don't understand. That his view has not, I think, has been dismissed completely out of the halachic system. Okay, I'll just maybe use. I only got a few minutes left, but maybe I'll just try and use it to talk about turning off a incandescent light, turning off a filament light. Which of these reasons would apply here? So this isn't clear at all. What would be the malacha of turning off, stopping the current flowing? So it's not at all clear that it would be mavashel. It's true that the wire would harden through taking it off the flame, through unplugging the filament light, but that's merely removing it from the source. So it would be a bit like removing a pot off the flame and arguing that should be mavashel because it changes the state of the substance inside the pot. So it's not at all clear that there should be mavashel in this case over here. Similarly, mavir wouldn't apply over here because you're not causing any light to come into existence. On the contrary, you're stopping the current, and therefore there's a cessation of light. So the candidate for the malacha over here would be mechaber, which is extinguishing a flame. So you're not allowed to blow a flame out on Shabbos or turn off the gas on Shabbos, remove the fuel source, because this would be the malacha of mechaber. The Mishnah says that if you have a bowl full of oil and a flame burning in the bowl, and you remove the oil from the bowl, you're causing the flame to go out earlier, and that would be the malacha of mechaber. So many poskim argued that turning off the light is analogous to mechaber because you're removing the oil, battery, the circuit from the filament light bulb, and causing therefore the light of the filament light bulb to be extinguished, in which case this would be the malacha of mechaber. So this was the sort of discussion that revolves around putting flames out. And until it was pointed out that seemingly this would not be de-icers, this would at most be d'rabbanan. And the reason for this is another halachic principle of Shabbos, which is the idea of malacha. You are only chayiv min haTorah if you do a malacha which is suricha legufa, which is where you do the malacha with a purpose or an intention, a tzorech, a need, which is core to the reason why that malacha was done in the Mishkan. So every malacha has a purpose or intentionality associated with it. Now, why in the Mishkan did they do mechaber? Why did they extinguish flames? They didn't do so to save fuel. They did so in order to create charcoal. So again, if we just do a little bit of history, when you pick wood from a tree, the wood is damp. I mentioned this before when we looked at making of the peg. The wood is soft and damp, and in that case, we saw that you bake it in an oven to harden it. If you wish to light such wood, it won't create a good flame. It'll create a weak flame because there's a lot of water in the wood. So what they used to do was they used to burn the wood or dry the wood, which is called singe the wood, which was the creation of charcoal, which removed all the liquid from the wood. And then when you lit the charcoal, you would get a very, very hot flame, which is what you needed. So the melacha of mechaber was extinguishing the flame in order to make charcoal out of this burnt piece of wood. So you would light wood, which would be the melacha of me'aver. You would then extinguish the wood once it had dried out in order to have charcoal. So that's the melacha of mechaber. Now here, when you are extinguishing the hot filament by unplugging it, even though it is the melacha of mechaber, your purpose in so doing is not to create anything out of the filament. The filament will remain unchanged. It's simply cooled down. And therefore, this would appear to be only d'Rabbanan. And we have this almost explicitly as a Gemara. So let's have a quick look at a Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph. This is source 7 at the bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3. Omar Shmuel, says Shmuel, Mechabrin Gacheresh Amateches B'Shut Rabim B'Shvil Sheyozichu Barabim. So I don't want to go into the full complexity of the Gemara, but very briefly, someone finds a glowing ember in the street, and it's dangerous, it's going to hurt people. And the question is, can you extinguish it or not? And basically, the conclusion of the Gemara is, let's just read the last line on page 2. If you hold like Rabbi Shimon, you can extinguish a wooden glowing ember on Shabbos to stop people getting hurt. So Rashi explains that for Isurei Teraisa or Torah prohibitions, you can't extinguish something in the street unless it's Pekuach Nefesh, but you can't extinguish it to stop people getting hurt. Rather, you'd have to stand there and move people away from it. However, if it's only an Issur D'Rabbanan, you would be allowed to extinguish it on Shabbos in order to avoid damage to the public. So Chazal didn't make an Issur D'Rabbanan on extinguishing something to prevent the public being hurt. And the Gemara seems to say that according to Rabbi Shimon, who holds that melacha she'en tzrich l'gufa, translation, a melacha which isn't done for the core purpose for which it was done in the Mishkan is not prohibited min haTorah, it's only prohibited midrabanan, it's only asur d'Rabbanan. So just to summarize, we're not going to go into all the details of this, but there's a significant machlokas as to whether melacha she'en tzrich l'gufa, a melacha where you're not doing it for the core purpose of the melacha, is asur min haTorah or d'Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon holds it's only asur d'Rabbanan, and the Gemara seems to say explicitly that extinguishing, which is done just to stop a flame being there, but not to create charcoal, would only be d'Rabbanan because of the din of melacha she'en tzrich l'gufa. So this was brought by many Poskim to argue that putting out a filament light bulb would be d'Rabbanan, not de-icers, as far as, and this is the crucial word, as far as the filament element of it is concerned. What we need to look at in our next year is not the filament element, but what about the current itself? So just to summarize what we've said, all we've covered in today's share is the filament element. Is causing a filament to glow on Shabbos, a melacha de-icer or not? The answer is everyone agrees. Everyone who has entered the halachic system has agreed that this is awesome in our Torah because of mevashel and or mavir, and therefore this issur would apply both on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. Causing a filament to glow would be awesome in our Torah. Turning off a filament would be only asur d'Rabbanan because of another consideration, which is the svara of melacha she'en tzrich l'gufa, when that you're not doing it for the core intention that the melacha was done in the Mishkan. With that, we conclude filament light bulbs. What we will look at the next time we meet is any other form of electric current where there is no filament light bulb, what would be the halacha. And as I said, this is relevant for almost all modern devices, other than where we still have glowing wires like the backup freezers or heat sources, heaters and the like. So that's what we will discuss in Mi'at Hashem our next year. Let's just maybe talk for 1 minute, if that's okay, about timings for the next time we meet. Did we come to a conclusion about when our next learning session is?
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. Yes, said